welcome everyone to our last panel of this pretty jam-packed week. In recognition of our adding social good as a new IC3 grand challenge, we decided to hold a panel on the topic, and I'm delighted to have three really excellent panelists with me here today. The first, sort of in order of alphabetical order by first name, is Jill Carlson, who's co-founder of the Open Money Initiative, which is a nonprofit research organization working to guarantee the right to a free and open financial system. Jill's also a CoinDesk columnist and an investor, a principal at Slow Ventures. Next, we have Srdjan Čapkun, who's a professor at ETH Zurich. Srdjan's background is in wireless security, among other things, but his group, as most of you know, has recently done a number of high-profile projects in the blockchain arena, including a number of attacks on Bitcoin and investigation of applications of trusted hardware to cryptocurrency, for purposes of privacy, for instance. And finally, Vanessa Grellet, Executive Director for Global Partnerships and Alliances at Consensys, is joining us. She's joining us today, though, in a different role, her role as the member of the Board of Directors at the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition, which is a nonprofit, as its name suggested, directed at social impact. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists, in the order in which I introduced you, to talk about your projects. We'll start with Jill. I've allotted roughly 10 minutes for each brief presentation, and then we'll hold a discussion among the panelists, and then we probably will have some time for a brief Q&A with the audience. So Jill, would you like to begin?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll just start by saying what a privilege it is to be here, just scrolling down the attendees list. A lot of people I follow on Twitter and whose research I've long followed. And really, you know, my aim today and my aim in most of my work within the industry is to figure out how to take that research and make it very actionable in people's lives with a focus on those who need it most. And so again, today I'll talk a little bit about the work that I and several others have done via the Open Money Initiative. So let me see if I can share my screen here. Hopefully that works. Can you all see this?
Yes.
I'm gonna, yeah, great. So the Open Money Initiative, as Ari introduced, we're a research-oriented nonprofit. And I'll give a little bit of background as to how we came to create this and sort of the mission behind it. I co-founded this a couple of years ago with a couple of friends in the industry, one who is an engineer who had done work at various startups, one who is a designer, was formerly a designer, with IDEO and had done a lot of work on Bitcoin wallets, creating a Grin wallet, things like that. Alejandro Machado and Jamal Montesor, and we started a conversation about the work that we'd done in the space and sort of came to a place of honestly kind of mutual frustration as to where the cryptocurrency industry was as a whole in terms of implementing these things. And we all kind of realized that, you know, we all get up on stage at conferences, you know, probably much like this, and boot camps and things like that. And we all love to say, you know, okay, well, Bitcoin maybe isn't serving, you know, a huge role in our day-to-day lives, but in places like Venezuela that are experiencing capital controls or hyperinflation, et cetera, that's where it's really needed. And we all sort of looked at each other and realized, we're not actually sure how true that is or what that actually looks like on the ground. And the more that we started to talk to our respective organizations and other companies and startups that we respected in the space, we realized that by and large, at least at the time, a couple of years ago, no one was really sure what that might look like on the ground in terms of, what money usage patterns look like in these places that we all purportedly are serving and want to serve. And so thus the Open Money Initiative was born. And it was really born with the goal of, creating access to a free and open financial system. We fundamentally believed that this is a basic human right. Interestingly, we've done a lot of work with the Human Rights Foundation, other activism orgs in the intervening years, and we've realized that very often, actually, this sort of financial element of what human rights look like is left completely out. If you look at, articles of UN charters and things like that, very seldomly do they address sort of people's financial rights or economic rights. And so again, that sparked for us just this idea that, okay, this is a conversation that needs to be had. And specifically, this is an area where more research needs to be done as to, again, what this looks like in practice on the ground. And so what is the Open Money Initiative? As you can tell, we're a very mission-driven organization. As you can also tell based on sort of our backgrounds and what I outlined, we believe in the power of technology. My co-founders have CS backgrounds and product design backgrounds. My background is more on the strategy side, but I've had the privilege of working with many crypto orgs over the years. And, we also work very closely with activism communities in all of the countries where we've done work. And then the thing that I really want to highlight, though, on this slide, and also moving forward to the next slide, is that we take more of kind of a design systems thinking approach to the problems that we explore here. So the research that we've done, and I'll get more into this in a second, color it all in. The research that we've done is less academic. I've done a bit of academic research around these topics in the past where it's all sort of very statistical and quantitative, and you're trying to quantify, okay, what percentage of Bitcoin flows in a given country are for X purpose or Y purpose. What we were looking for was much less in that category and much more in the category of, again, kind of design thinking, where we asked questions like, what does it look like, in day-to-day life to try and move money out of one of these countries? Or what are the various hacks that people are using in their lives today in order to evade inflation, or in order to send money across the country to a family member, or in order to save? And the idea there is really to take this research and share it, of course, with people like you, and also with various startups, et cetera, that are already working in the space, such that they might implement these findings into their products, and continue to drive forward in that way. And so some of the themes that we explore are, of course, things like financial health. How can people safeguard their savings and their wealth in places where there's a monetary crisis? How do communities come together, communities of commerce, marketplaces, et cetera, in these types of places? We explore safety and security, of course, so questions of privacy, confidentiality, things like that. And then also a lot of this is around education and support systems. If we see a methodology that someone is using in one area, how can we help people in other areas, or people who might not quite have the same access today to access that down the line? And so our methodology, I started to get into this already. We use things like ethnographic interviews, these sort of long, in-depth 2-hour interviews. We come up with product concepts based on those interviews and then iterate with the people with whom we chat. Displacement experiments where we ask people in these communities to get well out of their comfort zone. So one example that we conducted in Venezuela was we gave people Bitcoin and we asked them, okay, we want you to find a way to go and spend this. And these were people who, may not have had any experience with cryptocurrency or any of these technologies previously. And there's a lot that obviously can be learned from an experiment like that. And then finally, diary studies. So asking people to often voice record sort of what they're doing in their daily lives, how they're going about navigating, again, challenges of inflation or things like this. And so, you know, one example of the one project that we've completed so far, we have others sort of in the pipeline that we're working on to further this. But we started with Venezuela, which to us felt like sort of the most acute place in the world, certainly at the time, I think even still so. It was experiencing over 10 million% inflation a year at that point. It hasn't really gotten better since then. Massive devaluation of the local currency, capital controls, so major restrictions on how people can get their money in and out of the country. And I'll just provide to you very quickly here as we sort of wrap up a few examples of the types of insights and findings that we found there, and then sort of extrapolate that to other regions and locations where, again, we're working on things kind of in real time now. So this is one example of a woman who is 48 years old. She's a baker, and she had left her home in Venezuela to move to Colombia. And in chatting with her, she had all of these stories about how she'd managed to bring her wealth and her savings with her when she left Venezuela. She would drive across the border with her belongings, and the corrupt border guards, there would be a whole line of cars in front of her, and she could see the border guards shaking people down and, taking whatever they wanted, sometimes alcohol, sometimes very often whatever loose cash was in the car. But she said, no, I outsmarted them though. I put money everywhere. I put it in the soles of my shoes and my bra. She even put it in her hair. And so you can see here, this is an image of her hiding it in her hair bun. And so these types of tactics are both sort of a demonstration of the extremes to which people go and the degree of the problem that exists there, but also, an example of people being very creative in order to survive. One of the more surprising things that we found in Venezuela, and this again certainly applies to other places, is that high inflation, a lot of the time these problems are not just traumas for people, but they can actually create opportunities if you are positioned correctly. And so one gentleman we spoke to shared that high inflation has actually made a lot of millionaires because the banks still have to continue to lend money, even in Venezuela. And so the banks then are lending money at this loss. That, of course, gets subsidized by the government. But if you're already wealthy, if you already have connections to a bank, then you can take out these massive loans from the bank, and that loan then gets inflated away to almost zero. And so that was another very surprising and sort of interesting insight for us, that it's not always bad for people, but it certainly exacerbates inequality. One that I feel is very relevant to this group probably is in terms of thinking about what people are even able to do in order to continually overcome and get around and navigate these types of problems. Often, these types of issues are accompanied by things like rolling power outages and blackouts and internet outages. And so what you find in Venezuela actually has a very high penetration of mobile money, of online banking. But when the power outages and the internet outages are happening, you can't even access that. So let alone using Bitcoin. So there it becomes interesting to ask questions like, well, what would a mesh network look like in places like this, and sort of prompts like that. And then I've saved sort of the most relevant example for last here, which is the example of a young woman who she and her boyfriend bought Bitcoin mining machines. And this is sort of the canonical example, right, that we all love to hear about and point to, where she has generated massive savings for her family using these Bitcoin mining machines. It's important to note that energy is very, very cheap in Venezuela, and so that's how she was able to do so. And then she leverages local Bitcoins, both as her wallet and also as her system of exchange to change into bolivars. And so this is just a very small peek behind the curtain. There's lots more that I can share at some point and will in the panel of the type of work that the Open Money Initiative does. And I've alluded to this a little bit, but we're working on projects now, just sort of getting off the ground in places like the Middle East. Lebanon, of course, is experiencing very high inflation. Places that are even more extreme than Venezuela, even places like Cuba is another one that we're exploring. And then the last thing I'll just mention quickly here is something that has really come to mind for me over the last couple of months is how relevant all of this research is, even in our own backyard in the United States, as people, you know, we've seen a wave of sort of social activism and people becoming more cognizant of their own money, of potential inflation fears down the line in the United States, and also issues like privacy. And so I'll leave it there for now and pass the mic, but thank you all again for having me. It's a huge privilege to get to be here and share and talk with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. That was really fascinating. We often talk about this hypothetical scenario of needing to leave the country with only the clothes on your back. And this is often a motivation for holding cryptocurrency, but you're actually describing a textbook example with this border guard shakedown. It's really interesting.
Indeed, yeah, it really does happen, unfortunately.
Okay, next, Srdjan, do you want to talk about DP3T?
So I guess you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Maybe someone can confirm. Okay, thank you. So yeah, thanks again for the invite. I really appreciate being here and talking about this this project, which has consumed much of my time and the time of my colleagues, especially at ETH and EPFL. And I guess by now most people have heard about contact tracing and the exposure notification framework finally built by. At least implemented in the operating systems of Android and iOS, right? And so we started this project some months ago, and you can see the sort of composition of the partners in the project that got involved over time in building this system. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Of course, it's in the end, in one way, it's a fairly simple system. As you will see, I will explain the main technical ideas behind it. But at the same time, it's quite fascinating and quite complex, both socially and legally, and also in terms of the emotions that it generates for various reasons. So. What is this project about? So it's about building something that's a decentralized, privacy-preserving digital contact tracing or proximity tracing, or as different names were used. And this essentially means that we would like to facilitate the process of contact tracing, which is typically done manually. So all of us are facing this COVID-19 epidemic, and we know that the virus spreads through contacts. And clearly, the idea which popped up in many people's heads was, let's build something that leverages technology to register these contacts, because these contacts, as we all know, might not happen only among people that know each other, but can also happen on the bus or in any other context where you don't necessarily know the people. So the challenge that we faced was to build something that would complement manual tracing and identify who was in touch with whom, so that when the infection happens, when someone is exposed, that they can sort of look back for the last 15 plus days or whichever number the epidemiologists give us, and you can sort of trace back who were these people in contact with, right? And of course, you then need to have a way to contact these people and notify them in a particular way, so you don't create mass hysteria and panic. And you need to do it in an efficient way, in a scalable way. You need to do it, especially in Europe, across all the European borders, respecting all the legislation, because you need to share the information across countries. And this is not as obvious as one might think, even if you, and especially given that we are talking about something that could be considered as medical data. And in some countries, these systems are even considered to be sort of medical devices that register these contacts. You want to avoid abuse, and you essentially have less than 2 months to build such a thing, right? Because we know that we are in the middle in some way, or in the first, second wave or third wave of this of this COVID-19 epidemic. And of course, we want to do it somehow fast, right? And it needs to work to millions of users, hopefully on devices that might be up to 10 years old. So how to build all this? This was essentially a challenge, and we went ahead and tried to address this. Let me give you a little bit of finally we deployed it. So I don't know how many of you are aware, but these systems are now deployed in Switzerland, in Germany, in Italy, and in many countries in Europe, and they're in operation. I'll say a little bit about those, how successful they are. Currently in Switzerland, we have around 1 million people out of 8 million inhabitants that installed and are actively using the Swiss COVID app. In other countries, the percentages are slightly different. So how did we make it work so that it is privacy preserving clearly, and that it is fully decentralized so that it protects the privacy of users? Well, the obvious way to do contact tracing would be to register people's locations, right? GPS coordinates, and to use essentially on their phone what is available on their phones, which are essentially fine-grained and optimized location information, which leverages Wi-Fi access points and even Bluetooth and GPS, and sort of leverage that information to just get a network of people who are currently close to each other. Clearly this, and then you can notify them using their mobile phone numbers and so on. This is clearly problematic from a privacy perspective. So the approach that we took was to essentially leverage Bluetooth connections and pseudonymity without revealing any personal information or leveraging location information to detect these contacts. And the main idea is that, and this comes from the epidemiologist, is that if you are within a couple of meters, and this in some countries means 2 meters, in some countries 1.5 meters, of another person during 15 minutes, this is considered to be as a potential infection, right? As a, if one of these parties has COVID-19, then there is a certain likelihood that the other party might be infected. And again, these numbers came out of the studies of the epidemiologists. So for us computer scientists, this was just an input that we needed to use. So the way that it works from the security perspective is that each device creates these random identifiers that are broadcast using Bluetooth. This relies on BLE advertisements, and these random IDs are broadcasted all the time, right? Essentially every several times a second, your mobile phone will transmit random identifiers, and these random identifiers will be changed every 15 minutes or so. Now, I know that some of you might already be afraid of this kind of an approach because there are some identifiers still being transmitted quite frequently, but don't worry, these identifiers are already transmitted by your phone quite frequently. So, this kind of a system doesn't really add much to what is happening already, right? They are rotated, which means that they should not be linkable in any way. So they're randomly generated. So now when you come in touch with another or in a proximity of another device, this other device will then register contact, will record these identifiers and store them locally. And this is quite a simple procedure. So every phone will scan every once in a while for the identifiers that are being broadcasted by the neighbors, and will record these and put them in a list that is only kept locally and not transmitted anywhere else. Now, if an infection happens, so if someone goes to a lab, gets tested, is declared infectious, at least in Switzerland, they get a code from the authorities that allows them to then upload their the identifiers that they were broadcasting to a central server, right? So these are essentially the identifiers that you were broadcasting in the last 10 or so days will be uploaded to a central database. And then anyone can look up in that database and they can see if they have met you in the last 10 or so days. Right? So this is essentially it's a fairly simple approach. You broadcast your identifiers and then later on you publish them if and only if you're infected. You never publish identifiers unless you're infected. So in the worst case, your privacy might in some way be impacted during those 10 days prior to the test that you have done. There are a lot of details here, so I'm not going to get into that. There are all kinds of privacy analysis being published on this. So yeah, so now clearly this is not such a simple issue here. If infected people are uploading these identifiers, and if you take a large country or a continent like Europe, there will be some issues with downloading large amounts of data to check for infections, and this works better or worse in some countries, given the data plans that people have. So one needs to take all of this into account, because applications are installed on a voluntary basis, and if people don't want to install this out of a fear of exhausting their data plans or draining their battery and so on, it's not going to happen. So another issue that we had to face in the project, which has been quite challenging and quite a lot of fun, is how to restrict the distance to these few meters that we need to consider, right? So how to measure 2 meters distance using Bluetooth. If you have ever played with wireless, you know that this is quite an ugly problem. So we spend a lot of time doing experiments with different phones, calibrating across phones, because different phones have different ways that they register the received signal strength. This is not very accurate and not very calibrated across the phones. So finally, an entire calibration process needed to happen to calibrate across all the phone models. This shows you some Swiss Army, aside from Swiss Army knives, Switzerland also has an army. So, and in this case, they were quite helpful in running the experiments at EPFL and helping us simulate some real social situations. In terms of security and privacy by design, we really minimized any kind of information that needs to be used. All the information remains on the phone except those random identifiers that are sent upon infection. There is nothing that is being processed in the central server. There is absolutely no inference, no social graph that can be reconstructed from this. So we are quite happy with this cautious design. Of course, this is a small part of the puzzle, right? The crypto protocol that I sort of sketched here is a very small part of the puzzle. One is to integrate this with the health system, make sure that that is also integrated with the manual contact tracing, integrated within the mobile operating system, and so forth. There is a lot of work there that need to be done, and because of that, we had to collaborate with the iOS and Android developers, and we were quite happy that this project had an impact on the development of the exposure notification framework by Apple and Google. So we are happy that they acknowledge this as well in their statements. It's an ongoing discussion that we have with them, and I have to say that it was a very positive experience in terms of the exchanges of ideas and the concerns that we raised, and that they also integrated. You have to understand that doing this without a control over the operating systems is actually extremely challenging, because the OS actually limits what you can do in terms of power consumption, waking up your applications, scanning, and also to protect other applications from each other, what kind of access one can have to the raw identifiers exchanged by Bluetooth beacons. So it ends up being a very complex discussion that also includes questions like sovereignty of states over such technologies. Some countries in Europe did not like that Apple and Google restricted access to some of these beacons. It's a very, let's say, a politically charged question as well. I'm close to the end. So in the end, we went through this whole process. We deployed the first version of the Swiss app, and now it's in use, and we are getting confirmations that it actually helped people. So it detected infections, and we all know that the second wave is coming. So we want to be ready, and we are hoping that that even more people will install this in Switzerland and in Europe. The updates to the exposure notification framework now will allow us also to synchronize it in Europe, so that an application used in Italy and the application used in Switzerland essentially can find each other, and that the appropriate crypto material can be exchanged, so that someone vacationing or traveling across Europe can also get notified. So in summary, it's a really fascinating project. We are continuing building this not only on top of mobile phones, but we are also we also plan to deploy dedicated devices. So with this, I'm happy to take any questions and discussion within this panel. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Srdjan. It's encouraging to see how much impact you've been able to have with your colleagues in such a short space of time, and also that Apple and Google were so receptive to the ideas you brought to them. And Vanessa, would you like to talk about your work at the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition?
I will share my screen. Hi everyone. So I'll be brief on the presentation. Just I have some slides, but they're not very detailed into what we do. But just wanted to provide an overview. We started the Blockchain for Social Impact Coalition as a sort of an internal project at Consensys, where at the beginning we were taking on some work with some foundations and non-for-profits who were really interested and intrigued. I would say more intrigued than interested by the potential of the technology. And of course, when we all started, or in the early days of Ethereum, we were really fascinated by the potential that this new technology could have as an impact, especially for more vulnerable populations. And so we started working with foundations, CSR departments of large corporates, and government entity. And basically we brought them in a room and asked, like, what do you think are the basic use cases that, blockchain can help with in terms of the social impact? I have a background in impact investing and have been doing that for quite some time before I joined Consensys. And for me, it was a natural fit or a natural dialogue to bring together the impact community and the technology, and trying to bridge that gap of knowledge and understanding of what we could do together. And we started off with 4 key topics, which were, supply chain, energy and the environment, identity and vulnerable populations, and financial inclusion. So those were the 4 topics where people could see that blockchain use cases could be could bring some solutions to what they're trying to solve. And we then started engaging with the more developer community and say, okay, why don't you guys try to build something? And so we started an incubator slash hackathon where people had 6 weeks to build solutions focused on specific topics around the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN. And we did that for the past 4 years, and we organized an annual conference where we brought together people to showcase really projects that were not just talking about what they were doing, but were actually doing things on the ground. And I think the key challenge that we've seen in this area is that there's a disconnect between what people think they can do, what people think they can do with the technology, and the reality on the ground of the problem that they're supposed to solve. So I think the previous speaker alluded to this, is like, what is actually happening on the ground? What are the actual habits of people? How can we help change the situation? And for that, you really need to be on the ground. You're not going to do that from your office in San Francisco or New York. And what we've been focusing on, especially on our incubator activity, is really trying to get the developers and the technical side to think about the human design, thinking about their solution, how to get feedback from the individuals or the organizations, and really trying to get that knowledge through, because without that, you're just creating solutions from your office, and you're not gonna drive any impact. So we've done that for 4 years. We have an annual conference every year. The next one is coming up on September 16th, and you're all invited. It's going to be around the clock. We really try to engage globally. Usually a lot of the US non-for-profits are US focused. So really trying to bring in, and showcase projects in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa, in Europe. We also have a third activity, which is advising some of the projects with governments. And this is one where Jörg Rhodes, who's also a lecturer at NYU, and I think well, Ari, is deeply involved. So we work, for example, on homeless projects with the city of Austin and other cities. We're going to get involved in a cultural project that is centered around antiquities and looted goods around the world. So we have a broad spectrum of things we want to do. We give free advice to these projects because we think it puts us in a better position to help them from a technical perspective and from an impact perspective. I also wanted to highlight that we focus deeply on Ethereum, where we do Ethereum and forks of Ethereum. We're trying to focus on that. And what we've learned is that social impact is hard. It's sometimes there's a misconception of what it is, and people think, oh, you're just a non-for-profit, you don't want to make money, you don't want to scale your solutions. To the contrary, I think this misconception has to stop. We see so many projects, especially in the payments, put forward social impact and empowering, the bottom of the pyramid. As a gentle reminder, there's 3.5 billion people across the world who are either unbanked or underbanked. And when you see Libra or PayPal, really put forward that agenda when there's so many technical hurdles and on the ground hurdles to actually make an impact, even if you're a very powerful and well-funded company. I think we need to come back to reality, to what the technology actually does, what we can do together working with governments and large institutions. So not saying that they're disingenuous with what they're saying, but what we see is a lot of people with good intentions or putting forward the social impact argument, but actually not doing a lot behind it. And but we're pretty excited to work sort of bottom up with large institutions. We work with the World Economic Forum. We try to showcase as much as possible what they do, because they try to empower methodology for and give tools to people to think about how they can roll out these solutions. But we also want to work with the innovators and people on the ground who can roll out the technical solutions and then understand what's going on the ground. So that's us in a nutshell.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. It seems like a running theme here is something you just mentioned, namely the disconnect between, as you put it, what people think they can do and what actually happens on the ground. And I'd like to discuss that further. I was going to give a brief presentation on a project that I've been working on with Srdjan and two of our students, called AIRS, Automated Incentives for Reforestation Stewardship, that aims to use blockchain technologies to combat climate change. But in the interest of time, and given that I think our audience members would rather hear from the three of you, why don't we embark on our panel discussion. To begin with, I'd like to discuss this disconnect. This disconnect between what appears to be possible on paper and what is possible in reality. Some would view as a chronic disease of academia and academic research. And Jill, you even sort of mentioned that your approach to research was anti-academic, although you didn't use that term. And it seems to me, Srdjan, that you took a somewhat non-traditional approach to DP3T. I mean, pulling together dozens of academics to work on a single project in a short space of time is almost unheard of in the context of traditional academic research. So since panels are meant to be controversial, let me ask the controversial question. Is it hopeless for academics to have strong social impact without departing from the traditional practices of academia? Right? Can we do research that results in publishable papers, but at the same time impact people's lives in positive ways?
So I had a lot of discussions with colleagues on this, and actually this project, I think, generated a lot of, I mean, in a specific context of this project, I think it was interesting to observe how many people came together because they probably felt, you know, frustrated, quarantined, and they wanted to do something about it, right? I mean, they wanted to help in some way. And I think this was an amazing motivator for many people to suppress their own, you know, let's say academic egos, if you want. I don't want to psychoanalyze my colleagues too much, but I mean, this is probably one example where people were able to come together and to move in the common direction. This is not to say that there were not, you know, other voices who criticized the way that we proposed how to do things. They have their own ideas, right? And the challenges there are, you know, in some way we cannot have 50 such applications running on phones, because then the system will not work. So we needed a sort of a continent or a global synchronization of technology, which is actually quite hard. So I mean, this is not over yet, but I'm just saying there's sort of more to it. The challenges are still there, but I think this is an excellent example that it is possible. At least that this kind of situation created enough goodwill and motivation, and showed that it can be done.
I would just piggyback on that and say that I think that one of the beautiful things to me about the cryptocurrency space is how multidisciplinary it always is, where you have, you know, researchers, practitioners, builders from computer science and distributed systems coming together with those in finance and economics and, you know, even politics, regulatory, all of these complementary, excuse me, areas. And I think that that's true as well when I look at sort of methodology, where I think that there is so much merit to doing what academics do. And I say this is somewhat of a recovering academic myself, so no criticism, of course. You know, where often it is sort of a much longer time horizon, and often, at least in my area of academia where I was studying economics, you're looking for sort of the mean and the, you know, statistical average of what people are doing. I think there's so much opportunity to marry that with then the type of work that I've done with the Open Money Initiative, where you're not looking for the mean or the average, you're looking for the outliers in order to gain inspiration for products, or, you know, as sort of startup founders often do, where they're moving fast and breaking things. I think that there's a lot of power in kind of marrying these two approaches and having sort of a multidisciplinary approach in that respect. And I say that not just to sort of be diplomatic to the room, but I genuinely believe that that's where you see a lot of sort of the rubber meeting the road of the research that gets done on the academic side. So.
Yeah, I agree with that. Interdisciplinary work is hard, though. Just
Absolutely, it's not easy.
Hard to have an impact in the real world. Well, Vanessa, what's your perspective on academic research as an investor?
I have some family tied to academics. I'm very, I'm very grateful actually for the work and the fact that we can actually get real data and real results to understand a specific, you know, constraints or situations. So I think that's amazing. We actually, one of our projects is a multidisciplinary project with one of the universities, where we're going to have a computer science department, the legal department, and then the history, I think it's the history department, who are going to work together on a project, and the outcome of that will be a hackathon. But they will have to have, you know, worked for quite some time on the subject matter. And I think we'll see what the results are, but I suspect that each party will be very informed of the constraint and the reality of the other discipline, which is not the case, you know, when you're moving fast and breaking things. And I think that's super exciting. That being said, this technology is moving so fast. It's hard to keep up. You know, everything changes very, very quickly. So I think a combination of both is great.
Great, thank you. To pick up on this notion of technology moving fast, I think one of the side effects is that technological innovations often have unintended consequences. And sometimes those consequences are the opposite of the intended results of the technology. I would say this is even true of Bitcoin to a certain extent, right? Which was meant to be an egalitarian technology to level the playing field in the financial world. And yet, if you look at the wealth distribution in the Bitcoin ecosystem, the corresponding Gini index, measure of income inequality, which one can apply by analogy to Bitcoin, is rivaled only by that of North Korea, essentially. So as you reflect on the technologies you're working with and trying to build, what unintended consequences do you worry about?
I have so many thoughts on this, so I'll just dive in, but I'll just stick to one point and one example for the purpose of this conversation that I think is very illustrative, where, you know, I tell the story of Anna Maria, who's the 22-year-old engineering student in Caracas, Venezuela, who's using Bitcoin mining machines and local Bitcoins as a store of value and a means of saving for her family. what I share less frequently, but I think should be shared is, you know, who's also using Bitcoin mining machines and local Bitcoins in Venezuela is the Venezuelan officials who are creating and perpetuating these policies of hyperinflation capital controls. And so that to me is what jumps to mind, Ari, is that, you know, when we create tools, when we do research, you know, it's not up to us, especially when they're open and permissionless, which are obviously fundamental tenets here. It's not up to us who ends up using them. And they're just as often used by who we ideologically might sort of deem as kind of the bad guys. You can have a whole separate argument as to whether, you know, they are the bad guys or whether they're just trying to put food on the table as well. But, you know, we don't get to choose who's using them. And it's not always just the kind of feel good, pat on the back stories. And I think that it's very worth being realistic about that.
So do we just have to reconcile ourselves to being purveyors of double-edged swords, or do you think there's something we can do to shape the destiny of the technologies we develop?
I think education comes in here, where, you know, we have to make sure that it's not just those who already have means, who know about and can access these things. And so that's the thread that I would pull on, but I would love to hear from Vanessa and Srdjan and the others as well.
I mean, my experience, at least in this in this last project, so DP3T, was that that instead of just having a discussion section in our paper saying, well, you know, this or that should be done, that the involvement of legal experts, also the involvement of civil societies and so on. I mean, and the wide range of people. In a project where one could see that negative impacts could emerge, that this really helped a lot to end up in designs that really minimize harm, right? Honestly, it wasn't obvious to me from the beginning where all the harms that we could potentially cause by deploying such technologies in terms of fairness, or even in terms of just, you know, let me give you one example, like the ability of if you deploy a particular type of a system, you could facilitate that the government quarantines a certain section of the population, right, by targeting certain areas or people and so on. So these are the issues that honestly, you know, only emerge through these kind of discussions and people who are aware of them. And so when we talk about double-edged swords, I think only a large set of people involved will minimize those kind of risks, and also will create a lot of public attention to those issues. So I don't see another way to do it except through that kind of a path.
So I think there's three components to this. One is, are we perpetrating the existing system without even acknowledging this? The second part is how, when we create new solutions, leveraging existing, you know, protocols, etc., how do we make sure that we understand who we serve? And the third one is, there are always going to be people who are going to use the technology for malicious issues, and even though they're claiming that's not the case. So I'll just go back to the three examples I give. And the first one is really about governance and embedding in the governance principles that allow you to mitigate any abuse or unintended consequence. And that's really key. And when you know, the Black Lives Matters movement re-erupted recently, we gave a lot of thought to this, and the income inequality that you know, most of the cryptocurrencies continue to portray. And so thinking about systems like proof of work, proof of stake, you know, at the end of the day, is it not a consecration of economic power that we're doing? And when you when you have that concentration of economic power, all the inequalities behind them are still there. And so is there a way to embed in the governance principles like diversity, principles like equality? And I don't think we've been thinking about this. We are in a capitalistic, world, which is perfectly fine, but we need to be conscious of that. The second one is, projects who are going to create and destabilize existing ecosystems, and a little bit like what Jill alluded to, have some players misuse the technology or benefit from it while acting in another capacity. And then I think the last category is really something that is particularly shocking to me, and we're going to see more and more of that, is with the emergence of digital currencies and governments wanting to create these instruments through CBDCs, and we're very active at Consensys in the discussion of CBDCs, the violations around privacy, the fact that you will have access, depending on how it's structured, to so much information about individuals and citizens is very, very worrisome to me. And that's just the way the technology is and what it allows to do.
Yeah, and Juel and Srdjan's projects shed light on the fact that privacy can be a matter of life and death, quite literally in the case of their two projects. Well, thank you, Vanessa, for what I think is an excellent summing up for the panel. I would love to keep going. This has been a really lively and fascinating discussion, but we're already over time. So let me thank the three of you. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.